this is a topic that I've seen so much controversy about. You've talked about it. Others have talked about it. I think it's a new hot topic. You've been talking about this for a while, and it came up in one of our first conversations, but the feminist conservative woman. And this is one of the most controversial topics that you can talk about. And it gets women on the right, I mean, steam comes out of their ears. They completely lose their mind when you start to talk about like covert feminism or, the feminist conservative. They don't want to be labeled that. They don't want to be associated with it, mostly because conservative women have, grown up in politics, battling, the pro-abortion industry and battling, the feminism that emerged in the 1960s. And they view themselves as completely distinct from that. But are they? I have found in many cases, no. So tell me a little bit about this and some of the pushback that you get, because I see the conservatives online. Rage comes out of their ears, and the reality is that a lot of what's being said about them is true. So can you speak to that a bit?
All right. So I have a very recent example, and I have to give a shout out to Andrew Wilson because he was just on Piers Morgan's show, and they were talking about this new show on adolescence on Netflix, which, by the way, I just did a big long video about on Sunday. I have watched all 4 of those. I actually did my homework and watched all 4 of those, so you don't have to. But he was on there with one gay dude, and like I don't know what the other one was, but Tomi Lahren was on.
Tomi Lahren, yeah. And I'm actually gonna cover this separately. I have a bone to but I want to hear you. Go ahead.
I like Andrew Wilson. I've had him. He's been on the show. I talked to. He's a personal friend of mine. But I'll tell you, man, he was in rare form on that show because not only was he like making some really good red pill like sort of points on there, and he's not. I don't think he would sort of describe himself as a red pill, even though
I don't think so either.
But he was on there, and man, he laid into Tomi Lahren, and I don't know what. Where does Piers Morgan get these people? That's what I would like to know. It's like, in what world is Tomi Lahren an authority on any of this? But no, she was on there. So at one point, I think Andrew had said something to the effect of like, the conservatives who are sort of undercover feminists, and she lost it. Yeah. And because, as you said, they want. I think a lot of sort of women who make traditional conservatism their grift, right? Their influencer brand, their personality, their online persona. They really don't like to be called feminists. And I think you and I have had this conversation before where I was saying that, I don't look at conservative or liberal as this, they're just different sides of the same coin when it comes to feminism, right? When it comes to like the sisterhood uber alles, right? I've been on record saying like, what was it, Rachel Maddow? If you took Rachel Maddow and you took like, I don't know, Tomi Lahren and you put them on the same show, they will fight like cats and dogs. But you put me on the same show with both of them, they'll lock arms and like be in solid.
They'll find a way. Right. Right.
Yeah, they because it doesn't suddenly all the ideological claptrap just goes right out the window, right? Because you're attacking the sisterhood, and so but women don't you don't have to look like Lena Dunham to be a feminist. I mean, you can look like Tomi Lahren and be a feminist, and I don't think that a lot of traditional conservative female pundit, for lack of a better word, pundits. Really understand their position. They want to still empower women. They still like cling to a lot of the stuff that Betty Friedan and Gloria Steinem were talking about in the late 60s and early 70s, and still want to advocate for the empowerment and the betterment and everything else or even ostensibly the equality of men and women. And you will see this even at like Republican conventions. You'll see this at Turning Point USA. You'll see this at the RNC at their annual meetings and everything. You look at any sort of organization and you'll see like very strong empowered women, and they'll lift them up and use some of the same rhetoric that you'll hear from the liberal side, and they're all in on it. And so So I brought that up, and I'm just like, traditional, trad femme women are just basically better looking, liberal feminists, and so they would lose their minds about that. I'm like, well, you're still repeating those things, and there's really no defense against that because it's what they're doing until they realize that they're doing it. And I just don't think that they like to be reminded of that. They just have decided to sort of, push the feminist agenda from just a different side of the coin.
Well, I mean, the truth is that the programming runs really deep. It runs really deep, and you have to be able to sit and look at yourself and say, what am I actually saying? Right? You have to be self-critical. Mm-hmm. You have to step back from all of the talking points, right? Because there are conservative women have the talking points against the left. They're all memorized. Mm-hmm. They can be spit out at any point. They're rehearsed. They sound great. And then they have the talking points against liberal feminism, as they call it, or old school feminism, and those talking points are all rehearsed. But what they don't get is when they sit back, they have to self-reflect and say, what am I actually saying that's different? And this idea, I think, that runs through for me, for all feminism across the board, is this sense of entitlement that really bothers me. It's this sense of, I am allowed to ask these things of men and expect them, right? I'm allowed to say, I want a man to do this in society, and I want a man to fulfill this role and provide or protect her. You use all the code language. But in the same breath, they get very hot and bothered when someone says to them, what about you? What can men expect from you? So there's this sense of entitlement, and that's something that runs through liberal feminism, conservative, whatever you want to put your label on it, this sense of, I am good enough as I am. What do you mean? Why do I have to meet any standard, but the guy has to meet a standard? And that's what rubs me wrong, because that is so utterly ridiculous to me that you are entitled. Why? Because you look good? Because your hair extensions are in place that day? Because you're a pretty girl walking down the street because you got a hot body? Why? Why are you entitled to say, I expect all of these things of men? But he's not allowed to say, I want a nurturing woman. I want a woman who brings the stress level in the house down, not up. I want a woman who's going to be a good mom. I want a woman who's going to be supportive and loyal and devoted. Oh, well, how dare you make those expectations of me? You just made a full list long of what he needs to do for you, but his list is a problem. So that sense of entitlement that runs through is what rubbed me wrong, and frankly what caused me to step back, because I grew up in that world of conservative women, and this feminism is different, and you'll remember our conversation you and I had about that. I had to step back and say, there's something ugly running through it all, and I don't want to be part of that. I need to call myself out, and that's really, really hard to do. But that is the resistance that these women face. It's kind of like how it's very hard to find a woman who apologizes. It's just the truth, right? They don't apologize. I dated a guy once who said, you're the only woman I've ever dated who apologized for anything. And I thought, ooh, wow. But it's true. They don't like to apologize. In the same way that they don't like to apologize, which is just reality. Every guy out there listening right now will say, that's true. I've lived it. They also don't like to self-reflect and say, I'm wrong about this. There's something I'm doing that's ugly, and I need to call myself out. So that's how I see it.
Yeah. Once upon a time, there was this lovely brown-haired woman that went on her podcast, and she was a traditional conservative, and she used to call her husband her partner for a while. And I checked her on that, and apparently she doesn't call her husband her partner anymore. She calls her husband.
And that's what I'm saying, right? You and I had that conversation, and I never even thought about that. I never said to me, it always occurred to me as, well, yeah, my partner, my love, I never thought about it. But
this is important.
But the difference is one person will be willing to look and say, what is that language? What am I actually saying? Is that really what I feel? Is that really, wait a minute. It was a self-reflection moment for me, which people are just not willing to do. Yeah. I see a resistance in women. There's a defensiveness that comes into play immediately, and the steam comes out of your ears, and you have and I think it's because we're so emotional by nature that rational component is like this big usually, and the emotional component is this big, and it's kind of a battle in that moment when you get heated. But self-reflection is the key to all of this, in my view.
Insight. Yeah. I people have asked me this before. It's like, what do you look for in a woman? I'm like, well, first of all, there's got to be sexual compatibility. She's got to be hot. Okay. Once we get that out of the way, what is
Rolo has a hot wife. I'll tell everybody now. I've seen the photos. Just saying. Go ahead.
Thank you. I'll tell her you said that. At the top of that list is insight, and finding a woman who is insightful enough to like check herself. Like when you're talking about like getting an apology, it's one thing to say you kind of owe me an apology. Another one is like a woman who takes it upon herself to say, you know what, that was kind of messed up, and I need to apologize. Having that insight is like finding a diamond in some beach sand. That's it's very, very difficult I think for women to be self-reflective and insightful. And I think that's also something of a quality that women really need to develop a little bit more, simply because if they want to be good parents, if you want to be a good, if you want to be a good mother to your child, you got to be able to like read the kid's mind, and think about what that kid is thinking about at that time. So insightfulness doesn't just apply to, your marriage. It also applies to a lot of other aspects. And I think that's something that's really sorely lacking in a lot of women these days.